The storm came down out of the northern ridges the way it always did in the last weeks of autumn, sudden and mean, dragging a wall of sleet across the fields before a man had time to bring the animals in. Kell Alderan had learned to read the sky the way his father had taught him, and the sky that evening had been the color of a bruise going yellow at the edges, which meant wind, and wind on the frontier meant trouble. So he had done what any careful young man alone on a small holding does. He had penned the grazers, latched the shutters on the barn, banked the fire in the hearth of the little stone house, and gone out one last time with a lantern to check the fence line before the dark closed in entirely. He was 23 years old, lean and quiet, with the calloused hands of someone who had worked the land since he was old enough to hold a spade, and the wary economy of movement of someone who lived far from help. His holding sat at the edge of the settled valleys, where the surveyed lands gave out and the wild country began, a country of black pine and cold water and old stone that no one had ever managed to farm. People in the valley town said the frontier made men hard. Kell did not think of himself as hard. He thought of himself as tired most days and careful the rest. The lantern threw a small yellow circle around his boots as he walked the fence, and the sleet came down in slanting lines through the light, and the wind pulled at his coat like a hand trying to turn him back. He almost did turn back. He had checked the eastern run and the southern, and everything held, and the sensible thing was to go inside and let the storm do what storms did. But there was a sound out past the tree line that did not belong to the storm, a low sound, not the wind, not an animal he knew, something that rose and fell with a rhythm that was almost but not quite breathing. Kell stood very still with the sleet ticking against the brim of his hat and listened. On the frontier, you learned to listen. There were things in the wild country that would take a grazer or a dog or a careless man, and the difference between the careful and the dead was often nothing more than whether you had stopped to listen when the hair on your arms went up. The hair on his arms was up now. He should go inside. He went toward the sound instead. He would never afterward be able to explain that choice, except to say that the sound was hurt, and he had never in his life been able to walk away from something hurt, and this was either the best or the worst thing about him depending on who you asked and what year it was. The tree line swallowed the lantern light. Under the pines the sleet came down softer, filtered through the black branches into a fine cold mist, and the ground was slick with needles. He followed the sound down a shallow draw where a seasonal stream ran in the wet months, and there, at the bottom, half in the water and half out, he found her. For a long moment his mind simply refused the shape of it, because it was not a shape his mind had a place for. It was a person. That much was clear even in the bad light. A person lying on her side in the freezing stream, one arm flung out across the stones, dark hair fanned in the black water. But she was not a person from the valley, or from anywhere Kell had ever been, because her skin in the lantern light had the faint pearl-gray sheen of river stone, and along the line of her jaw and down the side of her throat ran markings that were not tattoos and not scars, but something woven into the skin itself. Thin lines of a color he had no name for, like the inside of a shell, and they were pulsing very faintly, the way a heartbeat pulses, and they were pulsing too slow. Kell had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. For 3 generations now there had been ships in the high sky. So far up they were only lights that moved wrong among the stars, and there were treaties no one on the frontier had read and trade in the great port cities that no one on the frontier had seen. And once, when Kell was a boy, a thing had come down burning across the whole northern horizon, and the valley elders had said it was one of the Sky People's vessels, and had forbidden anyone to go looking. The Sky People were real. Everyone knew the Sky People were real. But knowing a thing and finding it drowning in your own stream on a storm night were 2 different kinds of knowing, and the second kind hit Kell in the chest like cold water. She was alive. That was the thing that mattered, and it was the thing that moved him before thought could catch up. She was alive, and the water was killing her, 1 degree at a time, and the pulsing lines along her throat were slowing. He set the lantern on a flat stone and went down into the stream on his knees without letting himself feel the cold of it, and he got his arms under her, and she was heavier than she looked and lighter than a person that size should be, all at once, as though her bones were made of something denser and her flesh of something less, and he lifted her out of the water and up the bank. She made a sound then, a thin broken sound low in her throat, and her eyes opened. They were the wrong color and the right shape. The whites were not white but a deep slate, and the irises were a pale luminous gold that seemed to hold what little light there was and give it back, and they fixed on him with the total unblinking attention of an animal deciding whether to fight or flee. One of her hands came up. There was something in it, or there had been, some slender dark object she had been gripping even in the water, and she raised it toward him with the last of a strength that was clearly almost gone, and Kell understood with a jolt that it was a weapon, and that she meant, if she could, to use it on him. He did not let go of her. He could have. She was too weak to stop him. But he had learned a long time ago that the way you behaved toward a frightened creature in the first 3 seconds decided everything that came after, and so instead of flinching back he went very still and very slow, and he said, in the low, even voice he used on spooked grazers and orphaned lambs, "Easy. Easy now. I've got you. You're all right." She could not have understood the words. He knew that even as he said them. But something in the tone reached her, or maybe it was only that the last of her strength ran out, because the hand with the weapon in it sank down against his chest and did not rise again, and her strange gold eyes rolled back, and her head fell against his shoulder, and the slow pulsing lines along her throat pulsed once more, slower, and Kell thought, with a clarity that frightened him, she is going to die right here in my arms unless I move. So he moved. He carried her up out of the draw and across the fields with the storm at his back, and it was the longest walk of his life, 300 yards that felt like 3 miles, the sleet driving now, the wind shoving him, her body a dead weight that grew colder against him with every step. He talked to her the whole way, low and steady nonsense mostly, the same things he said to sick animals in the night. Almost there. Almost home. Stay with me, just a little more. He did not know if talking helped. He knew that stopping did not. The house, when he reached it, was warm and low-ceilinged and smelled of wood smoke, and the herbs his mother had hung from the rafters years ago, before the fever took her, before it was just him and his father, before it was just him. He kicked the door shut against the storm and laid the alien woman down on the wide bench by the hearth, the one his father used to sleep on when his back was bad, and he stood over her breathing hard and dripping, and for one whole second he had absolutely no idea what to do. She was soaked through and freezing, and those lines along her throat were still pulsing too slow, and the cold was the enemy. The cold was killing her. That much any frontier child knew. So Kell did the things you did for a person pulled out of cold water. He built the fire up until it roared. He stripped off her sodden outer garment with hands made clumsy by care and haste, a garment of some dark material that was not cloth, that shed the water off it in beads, and yet had done nothing to keep her warm, and under it she wore a close-fitting suit of the same strange material, and he left that on because some instinct told him it was not his to remove, and because whatever it was not the thing killing her. He wrapped her in every blanket in the house, and then in the heavy sheepskin from his own bed, and he built a frame of the fire irons to hold the warmth close, and he heated stones at the edge of the hearth the way his grandmother used to for winter nights, and wrapped them in wool and packed them around her, at her feet, along her sides, and slowly, the terrible marble cold of her skin began to give way to something that was at least not the cold of the grave. And then there was nothing to do but wait, and watch, and keep the fire high, and Kell pulled the 3-legged stool up beside the bench and sat down on it and looked at the impossible woman in his mother's blankets, and outside the storm threw itself against the house, and the long night began. The weapon she had held lay on the floor where it had slipped from her fingers when he set her down. Kell picked it up carefully, the way you pick up a thing that might still be dangerous and turned it over in the firelight. It was slim and dark and heavier than metal, and it was warm to the touch faintly, as though something lived inside it. There were no obvious controls, no trigger he recognized, only a smooth, continuous surface broken by a single line of the same shell-colored markings that ran along the woman's throat. He did not try to make it work. He set it on the mantel, out of her reach and out of his own, and he thought that if she woke and wanted to kill him, he would rather she had to get up and cross the room to do it. Then he wrung the water from her outer garment and hung it by the fire. And as he handled it, he understood that it was armor of some kind, that the dark beaded material had places along the shoulder and the ribs where it had been torn open and then scorched, as if by heat, and that the woman beneath it had a wound. He found it when he checked her, moving the sheepskin aside with the care of a man diffusing a trap. There was a long, ragged gash across the left side of her ribs, high under the arm, where the armor had failed, and the flesh around it was swollen and hot, and the strange pearl-gray skin had gone dark and angry at the margins. It had been bleeding, but the blood was not red. It was a deep violet, almost black, and it had clotted into a thick resinous crust, and Kell knelt there and looked at it and felt the full weight of what he did not know settle onto his shoulders. He knew wounds. On the frontier you learned wounds the way you learned weather, out of necessity, out of the fact that the nearest surgeon was 2 days' ride and might well be drunk when you got there. He had stitched a plow gash in his own thigh by lamplight when he was 19. He had set his father's arm the winter the old man fell from the loft. He knew how to clean a wound and close it and keep the rot out. But he knew those things for people, for his own kind, and this was not his own kind. And everything about her told him that what worked for a valley man might kill a woman whose blood was violet and whose bones were strange. So he made a decision that was in its way the bravest thing he did that whole night, braver than carrying her out of the draw, and it was this. He decided to do almost nothing. He decided that a body pulled back from freezing knows better than a stranger how to heal, and that his job was not to fix her but to keep her, to hold the line against the cold and the wet and the rot, and let her own body do the work it was clearly trying to do. He would clean the wound with water he had boiled and let cool, because clean was clean no matter whose blood it was. He would keep her warm, he would keep her still, and he would not, whatever his hands itched to do, go poking into a wound in a body he did not understand. He boiled the water, he let it cool to blood warm. He tore clean linen from a sheet, and he cleaned the crusted violet blood away from the edges of the gash with a gentleness that would have surprised the men in the valley who thought they knew him. And the woman stirred and made small sounds, and once her hand came up and gripped his wrist. Hard, harder than he expected, her strange fingers closing all the way around, and he held still and let her grip him until the pain passed and her hand fell away. When the wound was as clean as he could make it, he did not bind it tight the way you would a man's, because he did not know if her flesh needed to breathe or press, so he laid a clean cloth over it, only that, and he covered her again and packed the warm stones back around her and sat down on his stool to watch. The storm rose past midnight into something that felt personal. The wind came off the ridges and hit the little stone house like a fist, and the shutters strained against their latches, and twice Kell had to get up and wedge a chair against the door where the wind was working the latch loose. Sleet turned to snow and then back to sleet. The chimney moaned. And through all of it the alien woman lay in the firelight, and Kell watched the slow pulse of the lines along her throat, and somewhere in the deep of the night the pulse changed. He almost missed it. He had been dozing on the stool, chin on his chest, and he came awake all at once the way frontier people do, fully and instantly, and he looked at her throat and the lines were pulsing faster. Not fast, but faster than the terrible slow rhythm of before and steadier, and as he watched, the shell-colored light in them grew a shade brighter. The cold was losing. Whatever she was, her body had taken the warmth and the rest and the clean water, and it had turned the corner, there in the dark, with no one to help it but a tired young man on a stool, and Kel felt something in his own chest ease that he had not known was clenched. Near dawn she woke. He knew it before she moved, felt her attention come into the room the way you feel someone's eyes on your back, and he looked up from the fire and her gold eyes were open and fixed on him. And this time there was thought in them, and fear, and a cold, hard assessment that missed nothing. She took in the room. She took in the blankets, the warm stones, the fire, the cloth over her wound. She took in the young man on the stool, his exhaustion, his empty hands, the deliberate distance he had kept. And last of all she looked at the mantle, where her weapon lay well out of her reach. And Kel watched her understand that he had found it and disarmed her, and chosen not to use it. And something moved behind those gold eyes that he could not read. She tried to sit up. The pain of the wound folded her back down with a hiss of breath, and Kel was off the stool and beside her before he thought about it, one hand out, not touching just there, and he said, "Don't. You'll open it. Lie still." And again she could not have understood the words, and again the tone reached her, because she stopped fighting to rise and lay back, breathing hard, watching him. He filled a cup with the boiled water, now cooled, and he held it out to her, and when she did not take it he raised it slowly to his own lips and drank a swallow to show her it was safe, and then held it out again. For a long moment she only looked at him. Then one gray pearl hand came out from under the blankets and took the cup, and she drank, and Kel saw the relief of the water move through her, and he saw her decide, provisionally, that he was not going to kill her. They did not have language, but they had the whole rest of that night and the gray morning after, and it is astonishing how much two people can say to one another with no words at all when both of them are trying. He learned that when she touched two fingers to her own sternum she meant herself, and when she touched them to the air between them she meant him, and that a certain tilt of her head was a question. She learned that when he showed her his open hands he meant no harm, and that when he pointed at the fire and then at her and made a small gesture like drawing a blanket up, he meant warm. You will be warm. She was quick. She was frighteningly quick, and Kel had the growing sense, through that long gray dawn, that he was in the presence of someone who was used to being the sharpest mind in any room, and that she was studying him with a thoroughness that had nothing gentle in it, and that under her wariness ran a current of something he eventually recognized, because he had felt it himself often enough, and it was grief. Whatever had put that wound in her side had taken something else from her too. He saw it when her eyes drifted to some middle distance and stopped seeing the room. He saw it in the way her hand kept moving, without her noticing, toward a spot at her collarbone where perhaps something had once hung and now did not. She had lost people. He did not need language to know that. He had worn the same look into the same fire on the nights after his father died. When the morning came full and gray, and the storm finally blew itself out into a thin, cold drizzle, Kel got up and made food, because it was what he knew how to do, and because a body that has turned the corner needs feeding. He made a thin broth of grazer bone and root vegetables, plain, nothing that could offend a strange stomach, and he brought her a bowl of it and helped her sit up against the wall with the sheepskin behind her back, and he watched carefully as she smelled it, and considered it and looked at him, and finally drank. She kept it down. He had been braced to spend the day cleaning up if she could not, but she kept it down, and after a while a little color came back into the pearl gray of her face, and the lines along her throat pulsed strong and even, and she looked at him over the empty bowl with those unreadable gold eyes, and she touched two fingers to her sternum, and then to the air between them, and then, very deliberately, she touched them to her own throat where the wound that was not was. And then she pressed her open palm flat against her chest and held it there. Kel did not know the gesture, but he thought he understood it anyway. He thought it meant thank you, and he thought it meant more than that, and he was right. It is worth going back, too, to that very first night, to the hours between the finding and the morning, because those were the hours the whole story turned on, and Kel would remember them all his life in a detail that never faded. After he had wrapped her and packed the warm stones around her, and there was nothing left to do but wait, the waiting itself became the hardest labor of the night. The storm made the house feel very small and the dark outside very large. The fire threw shapes on the low ceiling, and the alien woman lay in his mother's blankets with her strange skin and her slow-pulsing throat. And Kel sat on the stool and did the only thing left to a man in that situation, which was to keep watch and to keep talking, because the talking seemed to matter even if she could not understand it. So he talked. He told her, in the low, even voice he used on frightened animals, all the small, useless true things a person tells the dark when they are afraid and alone with a life in their hands. He told her about the holding, about the fence lines and the grazers, and the place up the draw where the stream ran in the wet months, the very stream she had crawled into. He told her about his father, who had built the barn with his own hands and fallen from its loft one winter and lingered 3 days and then gone, and about his mother, who had hung the herbs from the rafters that still hung there and had died of the fever when Kel was 14, quietly in the night in this same room, in the bed his father had built. He told her that he was alone out here and had been alone a long time, and that he did not mind it most days, and that some nights it sat on his chest like a stone, and that this was one of those nights, except that for the first time in a long time there was someone else breathing in the room, even if she was dying, even if she was not his kind, even if she would never know he had spoken. He did not know, that first night, that she could hear him. He learned much later that she had drifted in and out of a fever dark all through those hours, and that in the dark she had heard a voice, low and steady and kind, that did not stop, that stayed with her, that would not let her go down into the cold, and that she had followed the voice up out of the dark the way a swimmer follows a light toward the surface, and that she had woken not knowing the words but knowing, with a certainty deeper than words. That whoever owned that voice had sat beside her through the worst hours and had not once left, and that this was a thing that had never happened to her before, not once, in a whole life at the center of an empire. She had always been guarded. She had never once been kept. Twice in that first night she nearly died. Kel knew it both times, felt it, the way you feel the animal in the pen go quiet in a way that is wrong. The first time was near midnight, when the slow pulse along her throat faltered and skipped, and the shell light in it guttered like a candle in a draught, and Kel had gone off the stool and onto his knees beside her and put his ear to her chest, not knowing what he was listening for, hearing a heartbeat that was too slow and doubled somehow, 2 beats where a man had 1, and he had done the only thing he could think of, which was to take her cold hands in his and chafe them and keep talking, faster now, urgent. Stay with me, don't you dare. Not after I carried you all that way, stay. And slowly the pulse had steadied and the light had come back up, and Kel had knelt there shaking with his ear against a chest that was not human, weeping a little. From exhaustion and relief and the strangeness of it all, that he should be here, that this should be his night, that a life this far from his own should have washed up in his stream and become, in a single night, the thing he could not bear to lose. The second time was in the deep small hours, the dead of the night when the sick are most likely to slip away, and this time it was quieter and more frightening for being quiet. Her breathing simply began to go shallow, and shallower, thinning toward nothing, and the marble cold began to creep back into her skin despite the fire and the stones, and Kel understood that the warmth from outside was not enough, that she needed warmth from a living body, that this was the last thing he had to give, and that it meant crossing a line he had held all night. And he did not hesitate, because a life was in the balance and everything else was smaller than that. He banked the fire safe, and he took off his own coat and his boots, and he lay down on the wide bench beside her on top of the blankets, and he gathered her cold body against the warmth of his own, carefully, mindful of the wound, and he wrapped his arms around her over the blankets and held her, and gave her the only heat he had, the plain animal heat of a living man, and he kept talking, softer now, close to the strange dark hair. There, I've got you, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere, and slowly, over an hour, over more than an hour, the terrible cold went out of her again, and her breathing deepened, and the pulse in her throat came back strong, And Kel held the last heir of an empire through the darkest hour of the night and did not know it, and did not care. Because to him she was only a frightened, hurt woman who would die if he let her get cold. And that was reason enough. That was the whole of it. That had always been the whole of it. She woke once while he held her in the deep of it. He felt her come awake against him, felt her go rigid with the old wariness, felt her understand where she was and whose arms were around her, and he braced for her to pull away or worse. And she did not. She lay still, and after a long moment he felt her understand what he was doing and why, felt the rigid wariness go out of her by degrees, felt her, at the very last, turn her face a little toward the warmth of his chest and let herself be held, let herself, perhaps for the first time in her guarded life, simply be kept safe by another living being who wanted nothing from her, who did not even know what she was worth, who held her only because she was cold and he had warmth, and that was what you did. And Kel felt something pass between them in that hour that had no name. That was not yet the thing it would become, but was the seed of it. And he held her until the danger passed, and then a while longer because he could not bring himself to let go. And then, before the gray of dawn, he eased himself carefully off the bench and back onto his stool, so that she would not wake in the morning and find him there and be afraid. So that he would give her back her space and her wariness and her weapon on the mantel, and let her decide, in the light in her own time, what she made of the man who had kept her through the night. It was, in its way, the most honorable thing he did in a night full of honor, that he took nothing, that he asked nothing, that having held her he set her gently down and stepped back and gave her the morning free of any debt. And she had woken to find him on the stool, empty-handed, distant, deliberately giving her room, and she had understood exactly what he had done and exactly why, and that understanding had been the true beginning of everything, more than the finding, more than the carrying. He had held her through the dark and then let her go, and asked for nothing, and there was no gift in all the wide empire she came from greater than that one, and she had known it, lying in the gray morning, watching a tired young man pretend he had spent the whole night on a three-legged stool. Her name, he learned on the second day, was Veiless, or something close to it, a word with a soft rising middle and a hiss at the end that his mouth could not quite make. And when he tried and got it wrong, she almost smiled, the first almost smile he had seen, a slight lift at one corner of her mouth that transformed her strange face entirely, and that he found himself wanting to earn again. He gave her his own name in return, Kel, and she took it into her mouth and shaped it, precise and careful, Kel, with a weight on it that made it sound like a word from her own tongue, and he thought no one had ever said his name quite that way before. The wound in her side began to close. It closed faster than any human wound he had ever seen, the dark, angry margins fading day by day toward the pearl gray of the rest of her, the violet crust flaking away to reveal new skin beneath. And by the third day she could sit up on her own, and by the fourth she could stand, though she was still weak, still guarding her left side, still watching every window and every door with the alertness of someone who expected pursuit. Because she did expect pursuit. Kel understood that early, and it colored everything. She was not a traveler who had had an accident. She was a fugitive or a survivor or both, and the thing that had wounded her had been trying to kill her, and it had not necessarily stopped trying. He learned this the way he learned everything about her, in pieces, without words, through the long, slow work of two people building a bridge across an impossible gap. She would go still at a sound from outside, and her hand would drift toward the mantel where her weapon lay, and Kel learned to still himself in the same moments and listen with her. And twice in those first days something did pass over, high up, a note in the sky that was not weather, and both times Veiless went white to the lips and did not breathe until it faded, and both times Kel moved without being asked to bank the fire low so no smoke would rise, and to draw the shutters, and to sit with her in the dim and the quiet until the sky was empty again. She noticed that he did these things. She noticed everything. And Kel came to understand, slowly, that his noticing was itself a kind of language, that every time he read her fear and moved to meet it without needing it explained. He told her something about himself that words could not have told her, and that she was keeping a careful running tally of these things, and that the tally mattered to her more than he could have guessed. They fell into the rhythm of the holding together. She could not do heavy work, not with the wound still knitting, but she was not a woman who could sit idle, and she began, on the third day, to follow him on his rounds, wrapped in his father's old coat with the hood up against the cold and against being seen, and she watched him tend the grazers and mend the fence and split the wood, and she asked questions with her hands and her eyes that he answered as best he could. She was fascinated by the animals. She would crouch by the pen and watch the grazers for an hour, and once one of the young ones came to the fence and pushed its blunt head against her hand, and she went absolutely still, and then very slowly reached up and touched it, and turned to Kell with a look of such open wonder on her strange face that he had to turn away to hide his own expression. He began to guess in those days that she came from somewhere without animals, without dirt maybe, without whether you had to fight. Everything ordinary about his life seemed to strike her as either miraculous or barbaric, and often both at once, and he could not always tell which. The rough bread he ate she examined like an artifact before she trusted it. The way he split wood, the swing and the crack in the two clean halves falling away, made her flinch the first time and fascinated her by the 10th. The whole physical labor of keeping alive out here, the sheer bodily asterisk effort of it, was clearly foreign to her, and yet she did not look down on it. That was the thing Kell kept coming back to. She could have everything about her, the fine strong bones of her, the precise economy of her movements, the way she held her head, said that she came from somewhere very high and very far above a stone house on a frontier. And yet when she watched him work there was no contempt in it, only a grave and growing attention, as though she were revising, in real time, some belief she had held her whole life. On the 5th night the second storm came, worse than the first, and they were shut in together for 2 days while the snow piled against the door, and it was in those 2 days that the real bridge got built. They talked, not in words or not only in words, though by now they had a scattering of shared ones, a pigeon of pointing and repetition and drawn pictures in the ash on the hearthstone. They talked the way people do when there is nothing to do but talk, and no easy way to do it, slowly, patiently, laughing at the failures, and it turned out they could say a great deal. Kell drew his family for her in the ash, his father and mother, and he drew the fever that took his mother and the fall that took his father, and Valus watched him draw, and when he was done she reached out and with one careful finger touched the small ash figure of the mother, and then touched her own chest, and Kell understood that she was telling him she knew that loss, that she carried it too. She drew for him then. She drew a shape that took him a moment to understand and then understood all at once, a great structure, tiered, immense, a thing like a mountain made by hands, and around it smaller shapes, and above it the stylized suggestion of ships, and she drew figures inside the great structure, and she drew a line from one of those figures to herself. And Kell understood that she was showing him where she came from, and that where she came from was vast and made of stone or metal, and full of people and hung in the sky. And that she had been someone inside it, someone the structure had been built around, though he did not yet grasp how completely that was true. And then she drew the thing that had happened. She drew the great tiered structure, and then she drew fire coming into it from outside and from within, and she drew the figures falling, and she drew her line, her own figure, running, and she drew ships in the sky above and a small vessel breaking away and coming down, streaking down, and she drew it crashing here in the black pines, and she drew herself crawling out of the wreck into the stream. And by the time she was done drawing her hand was shaking, and there were no tears on her strange face, because perhaps her kind did not weep that way. But Kell had learned to read her without tears, and he knew grief when he sat beside it. He did not know what to do with his hands. He was not a man who touched people easily. The frontier did not raise them that way. But he reached out slowly, the way he had learned to reach for her, giving her all the time in the world to refuse, and he laid his rough hand over her strange gray one where it rested on the hearthstone, and he did not say anything because there was nothing to say and no way to say it, and she did not pull away. She turned her hand over under his and gripped his fingers, hard, the way she had gripped his wrist that first night when the pain took her, and they sat like that for a long time while the storm howled and the fire burned low. Two survivors of two different griefs holding onto each other across a gulf that no map could measure. And it was in that silence, more than anywhere, that the thing between them changed from mercy into something with his name and her name in it. He did not think of her as a woman he might love. He would have said that was absurd, that she was not even the same kind of creature, that she came from the sky and he came from the dirt, and the whole thing was a temporary arrangement that would end the day she was strong enough to leave. He told himself all of that. And every day he told it to himself a little less convincingly, because every day he watched her grow stronger and more herself, watched the wariness give way in his presence to something almost like ease, watched her learn his silences and offer him hers, and every day the thought of the morning she would be strong enough to leave sat a little heavier in his chest. She, for her part, watched him too. He caught her at it often, those gold eyes on him across the room, grave and assessing, and when he caught her she did not look away the way a valley girl might have. She held his gaze, unhurried as though the looking were her right, and there was a question in it that he did not have the words to answer and was not sure he wanted answered, because he suspected that the answer would only make the leaving worse. He did not know in those days what she was. He knew she came from the sky and had been someone, and had lost everything, and was hunted. He did not know that the great tiered structure she had drawn in the ash was the seat of an empire that spanned 100 worlds. He did not know that the fire she had drawn coming into it was a coup, a murder of the old order by the new. He did not know that the figure she had drawn a line from, the one at the heart of it all, was not merely someone the structure had been built around, but the very reason it stood, the last surviving heir of a bloodline 1,000 years old, the daughter of a slain sovereign, the single thread on which the legitimacy of an entire fractured empire now hung. He did not know that the ships he heard passing high overhead in the night were not searching for a lost traveler, but hunting for the one person alive who could unmake everything the usurpers had built. He knew none of that. He only knew that her name was Veilous, and that she had almost died in his arms, and that she was getting stronger, and that when she said his name it sounded like a word worth having. That was all he knew, and for a while in the stone house with the snow against the door, it was enough. But before any of that, before the reveal and the field and the parting, there had been the long, slow days of the stone house, and it is worth staying in them a while, because it was in them that everything else was decided, even if neither of them knew it yet. Kell had not slept the first night. He had sat on the three-legged stool and kept the fire high and watched the slow pulse of the lines along her throat, and near morning when she woke and he gave her the water, he had thought, now she will rest and I will rest, and he had been wrong because he found he could not close his eyes with her in the room. It was not fear, exactly. She was too weak to harm him and he knew it. It was something else, a kind of vigilance that had nothing to do with danger, the same thing he felt on the nights a ewe was lambing badly, the sense that a life was in the balance and that his attention was somehow part of what held it there. So he had not slept, and by the second night he was hollow with it, and it was Veilous, of all people, who put a stop to it. She had watched him fight to stay upright on the stool through the second evening, and near the middle of the night, when his chin dropped to his chest for the 4th or 5th time, she had reached out from the bench and taken his sleeve, and when he startled awake she had looked at him and shaken her head slowly, the human gesture she had learned from watching him, and pointed deliberately at the floor by the hearth and mimed sleep, her hands together beside her tilted head. He had understood. She was telling him to rest. And when he had hesitated, torn between exhaustion and the vigilance, she had done a thing that undid him a little, which was to move over on the wide bench, painfully, guarding her wound and make a space, and pat it, and look at him with those gold eyes, and he had understood that the woman who 2 nights before had tried to raise a weapon to his chest was now offering to share the warmth of the bench with him so that he would sleep, because she had seen that he would not sleep otherwise. And because keeping him whole had already, without either of them deciding it, become something she cared about. He had not taken the bench. That had felt like a step neither of them was ready for, and he had seen in her face that she understood his refusal and did not take offense at it, which told him something too. But he had lain down on the sheepskin by the hearth where she could see him and he could see her, and he had slept, finally, deeply. And when he woke in the gray morning she was awake and watching him, and had clearly been watching him for some time. And there was something in her expression that he had no word for, in her language or his, but that he thought of afterward as the look of someone doing sums that came out to a different answer than the one they had expected. That was the beginning of it, the learning to sleep in the same room. The small negotiations of two bodies sharing a small warm space in a cold world. And out of those small things the larger thing grew, the way, Kel thought, most large things grow, not out of a single moment of decision, but out of 1,000 small ones. 1,000 times of reading each other right, of moving to meet each other's needs before the need was spoken, of building gesture by gesture, a shared language and then a shared silence, which is deeper than language and harder to build. He learned her body's rhythms as he had learned the animals. He learned that she slept lightly and woke at sounds, and that she was cold almost all the time, that his world was colder than any world she had known, and that she suffered it without complaint but suffered it. And so he kept the fire higher than he would have for himself, and he gave her his own sheepskin and slept under thinner blankets, and he did not tell her he had done it. And she noticed anyway, because she noticed everything. And one morning he woke to find the sheepskin returned to him, tucked around him in the night, and her sitting by the fire in his father's old coat, guarding her own warmth jealously, having decided apparently that if one of them was to be cold, it would not be the one who had done all the work of keeping her alive. They had argued about it, wordlessly, each trying to give the other the sheepskin, and it had ended in something that was almost laughter, the two of them sitting on the floor by the fire with the sheepskin between them, and in the end they had shared it, sitting shoulder to shoulder with their backs to the warm stones of the hearth, and that had been the first time they touched simply because they wished to, and not because one of them was hurt. He learned that she could not abide dirt on her hands and wash them a dozen times a day, and that she was ashamed of this, or something like ashamed, as though it marked her as soft, and so he made her a place to wash and kept water warm for it, and never once let her see that he had noticed the shame, and she understood that he had done this for her too, and the tally in her gold eyes grew. He learned that she was curious past all reason, that there was nothing in the small stone house too humble for her attention, that she would take up a wooden spoon he had carved as a boy and turn it over and over, tracing the grain, the tool marks, the worn place where 1,000 meals had smoothed it, as though it were the most extraordinary artifact in the galaxy. And perhaps to her it was, a thing made by a single pair of hands for a single small purpose, and used until it wore smooth. In a life she was only now beginning to imagine, a life of things touched and used and made, so unlike whatever life she had come from that Kel could not picture it at all. He asked her about it once, in the pigeon, gesturing at the spoon, at the room, at everything, and then spreading his hands in the sign that had come to mean your world. Tell me your world, asterisk, and she had been quiet for a long time, and then she had drawn for him in the ash a place with no dirt and no spoons carved by hand, a place where every surface was smooth and made by machines she could not explain, where she had never once in her life prepared her own food or mended her own garment or been cold or been alone, and where, he understood by the way she drew it, she had also never once been free, never once been unwatched, never once been permitted to sit shoulder to shoulder with someone by a fire and share a sheepskin because she wished to. She had been the center of everything and had touched nothing. She had been served by thousands and known no one. And Kel, looking at the drawing, had understood for the first time that the wondering he saw in her when she watched him work was not the wondering of someone looking down at a smaller life, but the wondering of someone looking, for the first time, at a larger one. That reframed everything. He had assumed in the beginning that she suffered his rough world as a fall, a humiliation, a hardship to be endured until she could return to the smooth, bright place she came from. And the longer he watched her, the more he understood that it was the other way around, that his rough small life, with its dirt and its cold and its carved spoons and its animals that pushed their heads into your hand, was giving her something the smooth, bright place never had, and that some part of her, a part she was only now discovering, did not want to give it back. They did not speak of that. There were no words for it, and there was no future in it, and both of them knew it. But it was there in the room with them through all the long days, and it shaped every small thing they did. And by the seventh day, when Kel brought her out at dusk to see the grazers settled for the night and stood beside her at the fence in the cold with their breath steaming in the last light, and she leaned very slightly, so that her shoulder rested against his arm, and he did not move away, and neither did she. The thing between them was as real and as solid as the stone of the house, and as impossible. And both of them knew both of those things at once, and stood at the fence in the cold, and let it be true for as long as it could be. The reveal, when it came the way the storm had come, out of a clear-seeming sky without warning, and it changed everything. It was the 9th day. The snow had settled and hardened, and Valis was nearly whole, the wound in her side a closed silver seam under the pearl of her skin. Her strength returned, her movements once again fluid and certain. She had spent the morning at the table by the window with her recovered weapon, and a scatter of small parts she had taken from the lining of her armor, working with a jeweler's patience at some device. Kel did not understand, and he had left her to it and gone out to break the ice on the water troughs, and it was while he was out that she got the device working, and it was while he was out that she learned the truth of her own situation, and it was written all over her when he came back in. She was standing in the center of the room, very still, and the little device lay dark on the table where she had set it down, and her face when she turned to him was the face of someone who has just been handed the worst possible news and has decided, in the same instant, exactly what she is going to do about it. Kel stopped in the doorway with the cold air rolling in past him, and looked at her and knew that the temporary arrangement he had been telling himself about was ending, one way or another today. She came to him. She took his cold hands in her warm ones, both of them, and she looked up into his face, and then she did a thing she had never done. She spoke, not in gestures. In words in her own tongue, low and rapid and urgent, a river of language he could not follow, and when she saw that he could not follow it, she stopped, and closed her eyes for a moment and gathered herself, and began again in the pidgin they had built, slow and deliberate, helping herself with her hands, and this time he understood, and understanding it was like the floor going out from under him. She had made contact. That was the first thing. The device was a way of listening, and she had listened, and she had heard the traffic in the high sky, the coded chatter of the ships that passed overhead, and she had learned two things from it. The first was that the ones hunting her were still hunting her, that they had traced her crippled vessel to this valley, that they were narrowing the search, that they would find this place, this holding, this house, and that when they did they would kill everyone in it to be sure of killing her. That was the first thing. The second thing was harder for her to say and harder for him to hear, and she said it with her hand pressed flat against her own chest, over the closed wound, over the place where something had once hung and now did not. She was not who he thought she was. She was not a traveler, not a soldier, not a refugee like any other. The great tiered structure she had drawn in the ash, the seat of it all, the thing an empire was built around, she had been born at the very center of it. Her mother had ruled it. Her mother was dead now, murdered, and her father before her, and all the line of them killed in the fire she had drawn, killed so that other hands could take what was theirs, and Valis was the last of a line 1,000 years long. the rightful heir to a throne that spanned more worlds than there were stars in the sky over Kel's holding. A princess of an empire, hunted across the void, hiding in a stone house at the edge of the settled lands, being nursed back to life on grazer-bone broth by a young man who broke the ice on the water troughs with his own 2 hands and had no idea, none, who it was he had carried out of the freezing stream. Kel stood very still and let it land on him. He was aware, distantly, that a different man might have felt something in this moment, awe or fear, or the sudden greedy calculation of what such a person might be worth. He waited to feel those things, and they did not come. What came instead, rising up through the shock of it, was a kind of grief, because he understood before she finished speaking what all of this meant, what it had to mean, for the 2 of them and the thing that had grown between them in the stone house. It meant she was leaving. It meant she had never really been his to keep. Not for a day, not for an hour, that the woman he had begun, against all sense, to love was not a woman at all in the way he meant it, but the living center of a war, and that wars did not leave their centers to break ice on water troughs on a frontier. And it meant more than that and worse. Because if the ones hunting her were coming here, then the choice she had made in coming to him, the accident of the stream, had put a target on his home and his life and everything he had. He saw her understand this too, saw it in the way her jaw set and her gold eyes hardened, and he understood that she had already decided the same thing he was deciding, and that she meant to spare him, and that she meant to do it by leaving, tonight, alone, into the frozen dark, to draw the hunters away from his holding and toward herself and die out there in the pines if that was what it took, so that he would not die here in the house that had saved her. No, Kel said before she could finish saying it. He said it in his own tongue and she did not need the translation. No. You're not going out there to die so they'll leave me alone. That's not happening. She argued, of course she argued. She told him, in the halting pidgin and in the fluent language of her hands, that he did not understand what he was refusing, that these were people who had murdered a sovereign and a court and a bloodline, that they would not hesitate for one instant over a frontier farmer, that his kindness had already cost him more than he could imagine, and that the only thing left that she could give him in return was his own survival, and that she intended to give it to him whether he wanted it or not. Because she owed him that, because she owed him everything, because she was the last heir of a 1,000-year line, and the one thing that line had always understood was that a debt of honor is paid no matter the cost, and she owed him a debt of honor that no throne could measure. And Kel listened to all of it, and when she was done he did the thing that decided the rest of both their lives. He took her hands again the way she had taken his, and he said quietly, "You keep saying you owe me. You don't owe me anything. I didn't pull you out of that stream to be paid. I pulled you out because you were drowning. That's all. That's the whole of it. And I'm not going to stand here and let you walk into the dark to die for me, because that's not a payment either. That's just one more person I love going into the ground before their time, and I've buried enough people. So no. Whatever's coming, it's coming for both of us, and we'll face it here together, where the walls are thick and I know the ground and you've got that weapon working again. Together. That's the offer. It's the only one I've got." She stared at him. She had understood most of it, and the parts she had not understood she read off his face, and Kel watched the last heir of a fallen empire, a woman raised in the certainty that the whole vast machinery of an interstellar state existed to keep her alive and apart and above. Look at a frontier farmer who was offering, calmly, with no idea of the enormity of what he offered, to stand between her and the death of worlds simply because he did not want to be alone with more grief. And he watched something break open in her that had been closed her whole life. She did not weep, because her kind did not weep, but her hand came up and pressed flat against his chest, over his heart, and her strange gold eyes shone. And she said his name the way she had said it that first morning, Kel, with the whole weight of her own tongue behind it. And he understood that whatever this was, it was returned, and that it had been returned for days, and that they had simply been waiting for the wall between their worlds to come down before either of them could say so. There was no time for more. The device on the table woke, a thin, urgent tone, and Valus crossed to it in 2 strides and listened, and when she turned back her face was grim. They were close, closer than she had thought. A vessel had broken off from the search pattern and was descending, following the trace of her crippled ship down through the black pines, and it would be on the holding within the hour. She told him this in a few clipped words, and then she was moving, fast, all the languor gone, the fugitive and the fighter surfacing in her together. And Kell moved with her, because that was the thing they had learned to do in 9 days, to move together without needing it explained. She stripped the device for its parts. She checked her weapon, and the shell-colored line along its surface glowed steady now, charged, ready. She looked at Kell's own weapons, the long gun over the mantel and the axe by the door and the skinning knife at his belt, and she did not laugh at them, which he noted, which he would remember, because a lesser person raised as high as she had been raised would have laughed at a farmer's long gun in the face of the void, and she did not. She took his measure, and she took the measure of the ground, and Kell realized that beneath everything else she had been trained for this, that a princess of 1,000-year line was not only a symbol but a soldier, that she had likely learned the arts of war before she learned to read, and that the woman he was about to fight beside was more dangerous than anything that was coming for them. "The pines," she said in the pidgin, pointing. She had a plan. He listened. She meant to use the ground he knew and the dark he knew and the weapons she had and the one thing the hunters would not expect, which was that the last heir of the Empire was not alone and afraid in a stream but dug in and waiting, with a partner who knew every stone and shadow of the ground they would have to cross. It was not a plan built to win a war. It was a plan built to survive a night. And Kell, who had spent his whole life surviving nights, thought it was a very good plan. The light was going. The short winter day folded toward dark, and the cold came down out of the ridges the way it had the night he found her, and somewhere above the black pines, a vessel that had murdered an empire came down through the cloud looking for the last woman alive who could take it all back. And in a low stone house at the edge of the settled lands, a frontier farmer and a fugitive princess checked their weapons by the last light of the fire, and did not speak, because they had learned to say everything that mattered without it. They did not wait in the house. That was the first thing Valus made him understand, drawing it fast in the ash. The house was where the hunters would look, the house was a box, and a box was a place to die. So they left it, out the back, into the blue dark of the settling snow, and they moved along the fence line Kell had walked 10,000 times, down toward the draw and the tree line and the black pines, and they took up their positions in the ground that Kell knew better than he knew his own hands. He put her where she wanted to be, high on the near slope of the draw, behind the fall of stone where the seasonal stream cut through, with a clean line down onto the open snow of the fields, and he took the far side, lower in the shadow of the pines, with his long gun and his knowledge of every dip and hollow the snow was hiding. The plan was simple, which was why it might work. Let the hunters come to the house. Let them find it empty and warm and think their quarry had fled. And when they came out into the open ground between the house and the trees, where there was no cover for 100 yards and the fresh snow would show every step, take them from 2 sides at once, from the dark, from the ground, before they knew there were 2. They came down out of the sky just after full dark. Kell heard it before he saw it, the note that was not weather, the same note that had made Valus go white to the lips a dozen times in 9 days, and this time it did not fade. It grew. And then the vessel came down through the cloud, low, silent but for that note, a dark wedge of a thing with no lights, and it settled onto the frozen field 150 yards from the house with a delicacy that was somehow worse than violence. And for a moment nothing happened, and the snow drifted down through the dark, and Kell lay in the cold with his heart going hard and his hands very steady on the long gun, because that was the thing about Kell, that his hands went steady when it mattered. They came out of the vessel in a line. 5 of them, tall, armored in the same dark beaded material Valus had worn, moving with a trained and silent economy across the snow toward the house. And even from 150 yards Kell could see that they were killers, that this was work they had done before and expected to do again, that they had come to a frontier holding at the edge of an empire to murder a farmer and a princess and go home, and would not lose 1 hour of sleep over either. They reached the house. They took it fast, 2 at the door and 2 at the shutters and 1 hanging back, and Kell heard the door go in, and he waited, and he made himself breathe slow, and across the draw in the dark he knew Valus was doing the same. They came back out. They had found it empty and warm, and they stood for a moment in the open ground reading the story of it, the banked fire, the 2 cups, the blankets, and Kell saw the one who hung back turn slowly, scanning the tree line, and he knew the moment was now or it was never, because in another few seconds they would understand that empty and warm meant close and waiting, and the advantage would be gone. Valus took it first. Her weapon spoke from the high slope with a sound like the sky tearing, a lance of shell-colored light, and the one who hung back, the leader, the one turning toward the trees, went down into the snow and did not move. And then it was chaos, and it was the ground Kell knew, and it was the thing they had planned. The 4 that were left did exactly what trained soldiers do, which was to turn toward the threat and put fire on it, all 4 of them wheeling toward the high slope where Valus was. And that was the mistake the plan had been built to make them make, because it turned their backs to the pines, to the low shadow where a frontier farmer lay in the snow with a long gun and a lifetime of hunting in this exact dark. Kell fired. He was not a soldier. He was a farmer who had shot for the pot his whole life, who had brought down running game at the edge of last light more times than he could count. And the man in the beaded armor at the near end of the line was slower and closer and less careful than a fleeing grazer. And Kell put him down with 1 shot, and worked the action and put down the second before the other 2 had understood that the fire was coming from 2 directions at once. It was over faster than it takes to tell. Caught between the high slope and the low pines, between the princess's lance of light and the farmer's long gun, the last 2 never found cover on the open snow, and Valus came down off the slope fast and low and finished it. And then the field was quiet again, and the snow drifted down through the dark onto the fallen, and the note that was not weather was gone. Kell came up out of the pines slow, gun ready, and crossed the field to her, and they met in the middle of the open ground where the bodies lay, and for a moment they only stood and looked at each other, both of them breathing hard, both of them alive, and Kell understood that they had done a thing tonight that should not have been possible, that a fugitive heir and a frontier farmer had stood on a frozen field and turned back the death of an empire, at least for 1 night, at least here. Valus looked at the fallen, and then at the house behind them with its light still burning in the window, and then at him, and her strange gold face in the dark was doing something he had never seen it do, and it took him a moment to understand that it was joy, fierce and disbelieving, the joy of someone who had expected to die and had not. But it was not over, and they both knew it, and the knowing sat down between them there on the field, because these 5 were not all of it. These were the near hand of a thing with a very long reach, and when this vessel did not report in, others would come, more of them and better, and there would be no ambush in the pines that could stop what came next. Valus said this to him plainly, in the pigeon and with her hands, standing in the snow among the men she had killed, and Kell listened and understood, and felt the night turn under him toward the choice he had known was coming since she pressed her hand to his chest and said his name. She had to go. That was the truth of it, and she said it, and he did not argue this time, because it was not the same as her walking into the dark to die alone. This was different. She had heard, in the traffic of the high sky, that she was not as alone as the usurpers wished. There were worlds that had not bent the knee. There were fleets that still flew her mother's colors somewhere out past the edge of the maps. The last heir of a 1,000-year line was not a hunted animal to be run down in the snow. She was a cause, and a cause could gather to itself, and the murder of a sovereign was not the same as the murder of a claim, And while she lived, the claim lived. And while the claim lived, the usurpers had lost. They simply did not know it yet. She had to go and reach the worlds that were still loyal and light the fire she had drawn in the ash. But the other way this time, coming into the great tiered structure from outside to take back what had been stolen. And she could not do that from a stone house at the edge of the settled lands. And she could not take him with her. She said that too, and it was the hardest thing she said, and she said it with her hand pressed flat against his chest over his heart the way she had before. His place was not on a throne, and hers, God help her, was, and the gulf between his world and hers was not the kind of thing that love closed, only the kind of thing that love learned to live across. If she took him up into the war, he would die in it, a farmer among fleets, and she had watched him refuse to let her die for him, and she would be damned before she let him die for her. That was the debt of honor, she said. And this time when she said the word *honor, Kel understood it fully, understood that for her it was not a courtly abstraction, but the deepest law of the bloodline she carried, the thing that had kept a 1,000-year line worth keeping, and that she was paying it now in the only coin that mattered, which was to let him go, to leave him whole and alive and himself, rather than consume him in her cause the way her cause consumed everything it touched. But she gave him something first. She reached to her collarbone, to the place her hand had drifted toward 100 times, the place where something had once hung and now did not. And Kel understood that she had lost it in the crash, whatever it was, some token of her house, some ancient thing, and that its loss had been part of the grief he had read in her that first gray dawn. And in its place she took his hand, and she pressed into his palm the slim dark object she had held even while drowning, the weapon, warm and alive, the shell-colored line along it glowing steady, and she closed his fingers around it, and she looked up into his face and said, in his own tongue now, in words she had gathered these 9 days for exactly this moment, slow and careful and clear, "You kept me, when you did not know what I was. When there was nothing to gain, you kept me through the night. I will not forget it, not through this life, not through the throne, not ever." And then she did weep, or her kind's version of it, a single line of light tracking down the pearl gray of her cheek, and Kel reached up and touched it with his rough thumb, wondering, and she caught his hand and held it against her face, and for one long moment on the frozen field, among the fallen, with the light of the little house burning behind them and the whole vast war of the sky waiting above. The last heir of an empire and a frontier farmer stood and held on to each other across a gulf that no map could measure, and it was enough. It had always been enough. It was the only thing either of them had ever really had to give. She left before dawn. She would not let him come to the field where the second vessel would meet her. She would not risk him being seen, being marked, being remembered by the war she was going back into. She said goodbye in the doorway of the stone house with the fire banked low behind them and the cold pressing in, and she pressed her hand to his chest one last time, over his heart, and he pressed his to hers over the closed, silver seam of the wound he had tended, and neither of them said the word for goodbye because neither of them had ever learned it, and perhaps that was for the best. And then she was gone, out into the blue dark, up the fence line and down toward the pines, and Kel stood in the doorway and watched her go, and did not follow because she had asked him not to, and because loving someone sometimes means letting them walk into the dark toward the thing that is theirs. High above the black pines, a light that was not a star broke away from the others and came down, and settled and rose again, and climbed into the cloud and was gone, and the sky over the frontier was only stars. Kel Alderan went back into his house. He banked the fire and hung the strange weapon over the mantel where his long gun had always hung, and in the years that came he told no one what had happened there because no one would have believed him and because it was not a thing to be spilled cheaply. He worked the land. He mended the fence. He grew older, though never old, the way she had feared because he had learned to survive nights. But sometimes, on the clear cold evenings when the northern sky burned green and gold with the light the old people called the sky fire, Kel would stand in his doorway and look up, And think of a woman with gold eyes and pearl-gray skin who had almost died in his arms and had gone back to take an empire. And he would wonder, the way you wonder about a thing too large to hold, whether she had reached the worlds that still flew her colors, whether the fire she drew in the ash had lit the other way, whether somewhere out past the edge of every map, a 1,000-year line had come home to a stolen throne. Once, years on, a light did come down out of the northern sky, and settled a moment on his field and did not stay, and left behind it in the snow a slim dark object like the one on his mantle, and a single mark pressed into the frost, 2 fingers to the sternum, which he had learned long ago meant asterisk, asterisk. And he stood in the cold and understood that across the whole vast dark of the sky, the last heir of an empire had not, through this life, nor through the throne, nor ever, forgotten the young man who kept her through the night.